Okay, so what we're going to just briefly do now is look at the manual. So the number one thing to remember about the manual is that it's completely normal not to understand it. And you shouldn't let that worry you. So it's highly probable that the first time you open the manual, you won't really understand much of it at all. But you can usually find nuggets which give you enough understanding that allow you to try and change some things. So for all of our commands, we have a command name and then some open brackets. And inside those brackets are what we call the arguments. And the arguments basically say what object you want to do something to and exactly how you want to do it. So with lots of commands, they've got defaults, so you don't need to supply anything, or you only need to supply an object. So like we had here, well, I've done geom_col here. That knows what to do with it without adding any more information. And it did do with geom_point as well, but I've been able to specify some extra information or an extra argument in geom_point. And the way you find out what those arguments are is to use the help manual. And to get a help manual up, use Google, which works quite well as well. Use a question mark and then say geom_col. And you don't need the brackets. So geom_col with a question mark at the beginning, and you press enter, and then over in this window here, you'll get the manual up. So the first time you look at a manual, it's a little bit confusing. So you have a brief description of what that particular function does. And then in the usage section, so here we're using geom_col, these are related functions, so you've got the same manual page. It's telling you something about the arguments that can go in there. So you can have something called mapping. That's what the AES is. We could have written mapping equals in there. Something about the position, whether it's stacked or adjacent, which doesn't matter here. The width here, whether you want a legend, and so on. And each argument that has a value after the equals is a default. So in these, wherever you've got arguments which don't have defaults, you have to set them. In this case, there are no arguments with no defaults, which is why you can just use open bracket, close bracket. And then further down, these arguments are explained a bit more. So here's the list of arguments. These are all the things that were inside those brackets, and here they are being defined. So for example, if we want to change one of those arguments to geom_col, like the fill here, so what I'm doing here is I'm setting one of the arguments, which the default is that funny grey colour. I'm changing this to light blue. Let me get rid of this one now. And in here, I'm going to say the fill is equal to light blue. And you might want to try what happens if you do colour in here. Colour equals, let's say, pink or something that's different to light blue that you can see. So there's, now I've got light blue. So you can either fill these with using colour names, or you can use the hexadecimal code. I've put the links in the slides there that allow you to look up the names or the codes in R. So colours in R, big long page with all the colour names you have that you could choose. So fill is what we call an aesthetic, and we can either map, as it said, or set that aesthetic to a particular colour inside the geom_col, like we've just done, or you can actually map it to a variable instead. So instead of putting the light blue inside this geom_col, what I can do is inside the aesthetic, inside the ggplot command, I can say that fill is equal to age. So what that means is I'm mapping this fill aesthetic to one of the variables. So if you use the fill, it means I'm going to get a different fill pattern for every, or fill colour for every age. So every time age differs, you get a different colour. So these are the defaults, and you can change those later if you want. So instead of having that in there, I'm going to have it here. And what I'm going to do here is spread this out over several lines. Oops. So I've just spread that out a bit so that it's easier to read. So now I've got different colours for every single age. Obviously this is overkill for this graph. You don't need to change the colour as well as have it on the x-axis. But if you have, let's say you had males and females, you could split these bars by male and female and have two different colours there if you wanted to. So you might want to try now for yourself, if you can use the manual to put the bars right next to each other. And if you found that easy, try changing the colour of the lines around the bar to black. So you need to click on that help page and that page will still be open, or you could just do !geom poll. And I'm going to look down this column of arguments, trying to work out which one might be setting the gap between the bars. It's this one here. So width, by default, is set to 90%. Slightly misleading, because what they really mean is it's set to 0.9. So that means that while these bars here, they've got a little gap between each of the bars. If I set this instead to width equals 1, and honestly, given the manual, you might well have done 100% and it will complain. So now I've said that the width is 1, it's actually expanded that out to, so they're all next to each other. If I make this 0.5, they'll be narrow. So this is how I often use the manual. I don't expect the manual to teach me how to do stuff, but if I just need to remind myself what the options are for doing things, then I might just quickly look in the manual to see what my argument options are. So there it is, width equals 1. So in this case, they're light blue, so you can see how they're all overlapping each other, or they're all not very distinguished, not overlapping, they're just not distinguished between the bars. So we can use colour, which, unlike the fill, which does the inside of the bars, the colour does the outside of the bars. So if inside your Geom poll you set colour to black, you'll get a border around the bars. So I think I've said this already, but to make your code easier to read, you want to use white space and new lines liberally. So put spaces around your equalses and your assignment arrows. That's in the wrong direction, look. We usually have it in the other direction. And after commas. So it's not essential for the code to work, but it's considered good practice and it makes it easier to read. And you can have as many new lines as you like. It'd be a bit strange to put lots of new lines in the middle of the code here, but it will work if you do that. But when you've got longer code, it can be helpful to say, comment the individual bits, columns on. Let's say columns, and then you might want to add something else. And first of all say, oh, I'm going to add points, let's say. So sometimes it makes it easier to access all your code, or access all the bits that you wanted. We'll read it later, I'll just take those out. So in this particular case, what I've done is I've split the aesthetic up over multiple lines, just so that I can more easily read all my code in one window. What we're going to do is change the x-axis or the axes a little bit. So one thing you might notice about your plot here is it sort of doesn't start at 0. So let's just take this width out. Or maybe let's put it to 1 and then add the colour on as well. It does take American and English spellings, by the way. It's built by a New Zealander where they have English spellings, but we have to make it adaptable. So it will take colour with a U or not. So now I've got this gap round here, and I think I'll actually get rid of the fill in there. And I'm going to spread this out and I'm going to make it light blue again. There we go. So this actually doesn't quite start at 0, and this is a common thing in R. It makes it good for when you're just looking at plots quickly, but in terms of publication, you always want to have your axes crossing at 0, 0. And we can change those with these additional, we call them layers, scale layers, that you add on to your plot. So we can turn off that behavior with what's called the expand argument. So you're going to add on, so put another plus at the end of your geom col, and then you add on this command scale x discrete. So in this case, we've got a discrete x-axis. If you had a continuous axis, we'd say scale x continuous, but we've got a discrete one. And we want to do the same for the y, so I'm just going to copy those. I'm going to put a plus on here. And then add those two on. So they're separated by pluses. Expand means expand those out to 0, 0. And because I'm giving you two values, they have to be collected together with a C. So now I've got this axis crossing at 0, 0, which is how we normally want it to be. So if you're finding this straightforward, you might want to see if you can use the manual to look up the scale x discrete. But if you've got spare time, you can read the manual there and do that little extra exercise.